Thank you very much. We really do appreciate your patience with us as we have been managing the technical delays. And of course, unfortunately, not being able to interact with Melons directly, but your feedback and positivity has come through. I'm a little worried about all of you. Maybe the sugar levels are dipping slightly, but I do want to encourage you that we will be engaging in a conversation now with two panelists. One will also be dialing in virtually, but I do want us to make sure that as we prepare for the questions that we're able to participate robustly. So if I may ask you just for 2 seconds, if you can kindly stand up, give yourself a stretch, maintaining your distance if you can, but we are aware that some of you are sitting quite closely, and we'll give you 2 seconds, just stretch, get the blood flowing again, because we're about to shift gears. Right? It's a hybrid event. We've taken all the time in the world to make the effort to be here. We've traveled far and wide. We woke up quite early. We registered. We made the effort, and now you're here. So let's actively participate to get the conversation and engagement going. With that said, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. As you take your seats, I'd like to welcome our speakers to join me on stage, who will be giving us some insight and detail into a very big question, right? Is it Africa's responsibility to liberate itself from international donor dependency? A huge question, a huge ask, and I think many of us might be perplexed as to how best it is that we need to respond and be positioned on this particular note. On that, I'd like to introduce my panelists who will be joining us on stage to give us some insight. As we do settle down, we'd like you to use the opportunity rather to engage with the panelists and, of course, share your feedback on the platform. If you could please help me warmly welcome on stage Mr. Bheki Moyo, who is the director and adjunct professor of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, and Mr. Sello Hatang, who's the chief executive of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He's previously the head of information communications and spokesperson for the South African Human Rights Commission. Please warmly welcome them on stage as they take their seats, joining us virtually.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. And joining us virtually, we have Takalani Nechitenze, who is linking via technology in true style as a Vodacom representative, right? She's the Director of External Affairs for Vodacom South Africa and chairperson of the Vodacom Foundation, who will be joining us to share some insight as well into this critical conversation. Big debate. Are we still a continent with a begging bowl that is being handed out to the international community and still asking, how best do we manage this? And this is what we're going to address here on the panel with my panelists. Thank you so much for your time and, of course, contribution to the conversation today. Given that we are limited in terms of time, let's get straight into it. And I think, Bheki, I tried to look at a few numbers in terms of how much international aid South Africa has actually been able to receive. And regardless of which institution you look at, it appears as though the numbers go into, well over $9 trillion US dollars, if I'm not mistaken. Big money. Where's that money gone to? What's the status quo? And I guess maybe let's hear your insight from a research institution's point of view as to what the state of foreign donors and foreign aid into a country like South Africa actually is at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Bheki Moyo from the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the West Business School. We actually established the centers precisely to understand donor flows and trends. And I think, as you rightfully said, over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in donor funding towards African countries, South Africa included. But of course, with the different pressures in different donor countries, we have also begun to see a decrease in terms of donor flows to these countries. Having said that, 90% of civil society organizations that most of you here support are still dependent on international donor funding.
Do we have any clarity as to what the reasons are behind the decrease in the inflows?
Well, the decrease in flows are multifaceted. One is the pressures in some of the donor countries. They've been forced to look inwards. Secondly, I think the pandemic like COVID forced also countries to also take care of their own. And so over time, we have really we've begun to see some of those decreases. And I think it's the call for us to begin thinking about our own domestic resource mobilization strategies. And I think part of what I was hearing earlier is really that concept of pivoting to new ways of making income, generating income, social entrepreneurship, among others, is what I think we should be talking about going forward.
Definitely. And I think that is something that we will challenge and reflect on in terms of what do we do in order to take control of this narrative. But Sila, if I can come to you just to reflect on the impact, right? We quote these big numbers, we see that foreign aid is still coming through, but have we seen a tangible impact of foreign flows of aid into South Africa?
I think maybe I should start off with how you scared the heck out of me earlier on.
How
You
so?
know, you have a person who is on markets and stuff. I heard Gugu saying, "We'll be looking at next session. We'll be looking at trade." I'm like, "Oh my God, I have no idea about trade. Nothing. Aid is what I'm looking
Apologies.
at. Trade
It's,
aid.
the economics is stuck in my brain.
Look, I think for me, it's important that if you look at impact, maybe we should first start with the question that you asked. Should we be freeing ourselves of international aid? We should, and we can. And 2020 pandemic proved that we can. And I'm going back to what Becky said, because for the NMF, for the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we were maybe sitting at about 80% international funding, and 2020 hit, that decreased dramatically, and we then
How
had
much
to
lower, if you can share?
about 40%,
Sure.
easily 40%, and after that decrease, it meant that we had to look at home, and to our surprise, and really wonderfully so. Our corporate partners here at home came on board. And most of them, they came on board with no strings attached necessarily, just saying, go and do what you need to do to make sure that people survive out there. But importantly, I think if you look at impact, if money is given to the NGO sector, CBOs, etc., you do see tangible. I'm not so sure about if it's given to government, on the other hand, whether that kind of impact you do see.
And maybe let's address that, right? Because isn't that the concern and the anxiety that's often attached with trying to mobilize capital within the domestic environment in terms of leakages and, quite frankly, limiting corrupt activity? Perhaps you can both address this before we go to Takalani for some thoughts.
It's an important one, because if you look at what happened when we launched with Vodacom, interestingly, when we were doing the sanitation project, and approached both Taki and Shamil about them funding the sanitation project for schools. And it became clearer and clearer that it's easier when a donor gives the funding to an NGO like us, or a CBO, community-based organization that then knows the stuff on the ground. With government, not only does the money go through processes that do not make sense, but in most instances, it then just doesn't get where it needs to. The second thing, though, that's still a concern, is looking back now with the mirror of NGOs, that the concern of capture of NGOs is also something we shouldn't ignore. So that's something that we should always be responding to. How does the agenda of the donor direct how you do the work? And Becky and I were on a panel. In fact, all three of us were on a panel 2 or 3 years ago. And the point was made about how Ford Foundation funds both of us. And we were saying how most of those kind of donors, they come in, they say, you do what you need to do because you know the work.
Got you.
And Vodacom is one of our funders who has the same approach. You do what you need to do because you know what the needs are. When you meet with Gogo Dlamini somewhere in KZN, you know what you need to then be helping. We can't tell you what you need to do.
Got you. If I can come to you, Taki, to give us some of your thoughts and insight. I guess you affirm that Vodacom does not have an agenda and, of course, supports institutions regarding their mandate. And perhaps you can also follow up, your lessons and your learnings in terms of the research that you supported in order to identify opportunities for us to scale and really level up on a local funding and the mobilization of that domestic capital. Perhaps you can share some insight there. The 2020 trap, it appears as though your mic is on mute. You can take it from the top again.
If I am on mute, it means they have muted me from their side because they could hear me. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear, you can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the Sillo is correct. Vodacom is a funder of the proud funder actually of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and it's a long-standing relationship, which is not one way. We also learn as Vodacom from what the Nelson Mandela Foundation does. So the challenge with us, the CSO and donor relationship, in our view, it is power relations, and it is not just a Western phenomenon. It is about, in my view, who holds the purse. The more funds are there to disperse, the more the need to ensure transparency and accountability. And sometimes this leads to unnecessary red tape. We do have this challenge too in Vodacom. Silo can tell you that there are times where we pay late and he has to nudge us. The applicants for our funding, including SMM, is not just Silo that want to access our services, sometimes find our processes to be bureaucratic, and that has made us to introspect. So, because our group CEO bemoans the bureaucracy, especially when there is a humanitarian crisis. So, we have now started simplifying our processes by onboarding as many NPOs as we can in our system so that the paperwork is done one time. And annually, we just do the corruption, terrorism, and money laundering checks. Fortunately, Vodacom's financial systems are close to fraud proof. So with a humanitarian crisis, we're able to disperse funds to an already existing NPO without finalizing the full paperwork under exceptional circumstances. Our systems are digital, and there is also an audit trail. And if the right person within the company approves it, then we assure that everything is going to be well. And to ensure transparency, we ask the grant recipient to send an implementation report after the disbursements of funds and the project. We have also started doing capacity building for our NPOs, especially the small ones, through various ways, which I will elaborate later. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ducky. We are cognizant of the fact that, of course, technology is a friend, right? But as mentioned this morning, it's a fickle one. So if at times you do experience or see or hear any delays, please bear with us. I think we've all been through some of these challenges, so we are aware that our technical team is also working on them. I do want to come back to you, Beggy, to help us unpack some of these insights. We hear that Vodacom is a positive example. We appreciate that we have other peers in the room who might be using the same format, structure. But one thing that's quite clear that's coming out is that the capital is available in the domestic environment. However, having access, influence, impact, and a measurable outcome in the local community still remains a particular challenge. I do understand that there's some research that you've conducted into this regarding the limitations in terms of connecting with local African communities. What is going wrong? And most importantly, help us unpack how best we can fix it.
Thank you very much. I think I want to also thank Vodacom, Vodafone, and Safaricom because they funded the research that we are referring to. And that research was basically looking at the barriers that non-profits actually face when they try to build their capacity to implement programs on the ground. And obviously, there are international barriers, and I think in the previous session and now we're talking about some of the leakages and some of the barriers that exist, and that's why philanthropy becomes an important component because of its ability to be flexible, to take risks, but also to go to uncharted terrains where government and other big institutions might not fear for purposes of their own reputation or branding. But I think, you know, as Selo was talking about government, we can say the same thing about international donors because what we picked up in the research is that they actually tend to support international NGOs. And most of the money that is said to be coming to Africa actually ends up in the headquarters in the north, but it's meant to be supporting work in Africa. That on its own is already a barrier that is created for communities on the ground to make an impact. But secondly, I think the language that we normally use in talking about development, the processes that we ask these groups to engage in applying, in accessing the funding, is so rigorous and so limiting for some of the communities and organizations that are grassroots based. And so they tend to be left out simply because of the requirements, the processes, the languages, and only the bigger institutions with an infrastructure behind are able to access it. But those big institutions, in most cases, don't have any embeddedness in the communities. And so you have a mismatch between the requirements of the community and the resources that are located elsewhere.
Some
So
might say, is this
are
the
challenges
opportunity
that
then
we
for
see.
government to play a role to actually facilitate those kind of conversations?
No, I don't think that's really the reality. I think from a policy-making point of view, yes, you are right in that government needs to regulate, it needs to put in place an enabling environment. So in that study, one of the limitations to building the capacity of civil society on the ground is actually the lack of an enabling environment for these organizations to actually operate freely, flexibly, but also to respond to issues on the ground. In most of the countries, and in particular here, we might have a progressive non-profit organizations act, but when it comes to practice, I think that there's still a lot that still needs to be done in order for government to facilitate a transformative and an effective way in which organizations need to implement programs on the ground. So I actually think that what we are looking for is probably a triangle of success. And a triangle of success here, we're talking about government, we're talking about the non-profit sector, but we're also talking about the business sector, all of them coming together in a platform where they can identify some of these challenges, untangle the bottlenecks, and begin to implement programs effectively. And we see this in the area of education, in the area of health, and I think we need more examples like that.
Certainly. I'm actually keen to also get your analysis, and I know this is not related to the report, but perhaps if we look at the current environment, the reflections of the pandemic, where we are with the crisis in KZN, with the ongoing floods, are we seeing that this level of camaraderie, cohesiveness, and governance in this trialogue approach, as we're having here, is actually unfolding in a country like South Africa?
I think traditionally and historically, we have always had solidarity in place in South Africa and other African countries. So that has not been taken away by elite institutions. It's still there. We saw it immediately after COVID-19 hit, how much solidarity came from even the ordinary people on the ground. So that glue still remains. And I think what then happens is that when it gets higher and higher in terms of institutions that are built to then build and take over that solidarity, we begin to see some fractures. But our people have always remained very much working in solidarity. And I think if there's any moment where we can see the higher levels of solidarity is when a pandemic hits. And so that still remains, and I think we should be building on that.
Silo, perhaps you can add on this, as you did reflect on the fact that the pandemic hit, we saw a great response from the domestic environment, and earlier you also alluded to the fact that South Africa can and should transition from having its begging bowl out to really looking domestically and forming lessons and a culture of camaraderie. Help us unpack, now that the world is slowly opening up, foreign aid might continue to flow and increase its contribution, and of course local investors and companies might also be looking to contribute to the local environment. What lessons and learnings do we need to implement now as we bounce forward, as was alluded to by Professor Madonsela, as we look to rebuild and maintain that vision on the North Star, but pivoting appropriately on this journey ahead?
I think the key to some of the things that we need to be unlearning include how we conduct ourselves, that as South Africa, we used to be the blue-eyed boys and girls in the international community. We were the exception. And we also treated ourselves like exceptional ones. We can't be corrupt. We can't be corrupted. Capture, what's that? You know, those kind of ideas of us being exceptional are fast waning. And as they wane, it means that we then have to learn new ways of living together, trying to help each other out of the rut we find ourselves in, but also making sure that whatever is there to be shared is shared equitably. Because there's, like, I want to align myself with what Peggy was saying earlier on, because in KZN, for example, you find that everybody has converged there to help communities because they've been hard hit. What happens afterwards? We always think that these things happen because of the floods. Actually, some of the communities we visit have always been having these struggles.
Sure.
I was there for 3 days last week in KZN, and one's heart was broken by how communities that were not, I asked the children, because you know that's where you'll get the truth.
Honestly.
So I went to the little ones and I said, how much did the floods affect you? They said, come on. Very, very little. So I said, what happened? They said, well, there was a little bit of rain, but they were not really that much affected in that community. However, the abject poverty they lived through, we fed about 500 people with hot meals first, and then groceries. With hot meals, 80% of those who were queuing were children. 1% could have been men. And there was one security guard I went to who was wearing the uniform of being a security guard, who came also to dish up. And I asked him, why are you here? Because you're working.
Yeah.
He said, it's tough. I haven't had food since yesterday, and I have to do night shift. So you've just saved me from that. That's not flood related. That's not pandemic related. It's stuff that we have turned our backs and we've begun to normalize. And normalizing the abnormal is what led us to this. So I think if we are to do anything, is to unlearn those things that we've become normalized to.
Yeah, such a valid point. And what I'm hearing and understanding, Takalani will come to you in just a moment, but you are emphasizing and underscoring the conversation and theme that Melon's also shared with us, is that you need to go and fully be invested in the communities that you work with. And I'm keen to understand, is there a challenge then that civil society organizations have in terms of keeping that relationship, maintaining that relationship? And I guess in this stream from funders or donors to civil society organizations, to the NPOs operating in the ground, to the communities, what is wrong with this value chain that we need to fix in order to make sure that that linkage with the community and understanding what the underlying issue is something that is addressed adequately? Open to you, Silo, and Peggy, you can add.
You know, it's one thing to understand the community and what they need. It's quite another to sustain the help.
Yes.
So with the best will in the world, most of the NGOs would tell you, like what we did when this last time when I was in KZN, to drive away from as we had run out of food. But the queues that were still coming, because word spread that we were in town. And the people were running behind the vehicle, and all we could do was to give them T-shirts, because that's the only thing that we had in our possession. But they are not looking for the T-shirt. They are looking, yes, they need clothes, but they need food, immediate need. So I think sustainability should be part of what we need to be talking about. And it's one thing to be a one-hit wonder, where you come in and you help people, you eject yourself. That's why for this year, Mandela Day's theme is do what you can with what you have, wherever you are. Because if we start like that, it means that each one of us then sees themselves as a role player in the big picture of sustaining communities to help themselves.
Got you. Got change agents really that we need to be,
Yep.
and not just relying.
We create them in those communities instead of us. The expectation of a Messiah to come and save me is what led to Madiba being attacked, the way Prof was saying earlier on. Madiba is attacked because his legacy is one that we thought, oh man, he's going to come save us. And when he didn't fulfill everything that you thought, because you're expecting the Messiah, create Messiahs in those communities so that they can save themselves too.
Got you. Peggy?
Yeah, I also think it's important for us in analyzing civil society's role in communities to talk about the different layers so that we don't really paint all of them with one brush. So there are groups whose function is really to play at the level of holding governments, the corporate sector, and others accountable. So these will be your accountability groups, and chances are they might not find themselves all the time with the communities. But there are groups that are grassroots oriented, their role is survivalist, and therefore they spend most of the times working at a community level. There are groups that are research oriented and so forth and so on. So I think from the perspective of understanding development, understanding the value chain, we have to think about how each of those different components of the ecosystem help each other in order to maintain the sustainability of the interventions that Sel was talking about. So I do agree that some groups are not embedded in the communities. And if they are not embedded in communities simply because of the nature and type in which they are created, we should understand and help them to create those links. So I just wanted to clear that up so that we don't think that all of them have this problem of connecting with the communities.
Got you. There are some positive examples to allude to, and those are the ones that we also need to learn from and collaborate from. And the issue of collaboration certainly does come up, because that's the reason why we all gathered here. It's the initial presentation we heard from Helen, who said, hold on, no single solution will come from a single provider, so we need to ensure that we all provide our efforts and our feedback. Taki, I'm going to ask you a twofold question here, which does speak to the theme and the concept of partnership. And I guess as you address this question, we really want to take the opportunity to have questions as well from the audience. We've got about about 10 more minutes or 5 for this conversation, just in order to make sure that we do keep up with the time as per the initial program. So as Takalani is responding, and if there may be questions in the room, please raise your hand. A roving mic will make its way to you. Alternatively, if you are on the digital platform, please feel free to type out your question, and we will be able to follow up on it. But coming back to you, Takalani, a twofold question here. Definitely looking to build up on, I guess, partnerships and perhaps even looking at PPPs and particular models that do work well that can be implemented in a market like South Africa. Perhaps if you can share your views and thoughts on that one. And something else which is also intriguing is, as we're hearing from both our panelists here, Silu and Beg, is that money is one thing, but you also need to be fully invested in the purpose and outcome of this objective and initiative, which is also a theme that we've heard from earlier speakers. How is it that institutions like Vodacom are not just providing funding, but also keeping and aligning themselves with their purpose? And of course, if you can build that up on partnership models that we can explore.
Yes, thank you. I would like to pick up on what Silo has said about sustainability. And let me just tell you this, that our parent company is Vodafone, and Vodacom Foundation is the only foundation, as far as I know, unless if something has changed in a few months, that does not receive a grant from Vodafone. Full funding comes directly from company revenues. So in the Vodacom Foundation, we have two programs that are guided by the Sustainable Development Goals, because we don't exist in a vacuum. We are guided by the Sustainable Development Goals and the National Development Plan. So we have adopted gender equality and education. And I heard Becky also mentioning the importance of education. From education, we also have an ICT Youth Academy that we run in partnership with Cisco and Microsoft, again, underscoring partnerships. From about 3 years ago, because the economy is not producing enough jobs. So to solve for youth unemployment, we deploy some graduates from the academy to our schools of excellence and the partner NPOs. The youth are equipped with the Microsoft and Cisco certification, and they assist the NPO and the school with capacity building. They train the staff on basic computer literacy, and they assist with admin work in order to digitize the systems of the NPO to transition from paper to electronic records. By giving the NPOs these skills, it also helps them to navigate our online annual application forms for donor funding. They also assist with interpretation of the forms and also the completion of the forms, which then removes the admin burden from the applicant. We've also started redefining our relationship with the NPOs to create what we call a symbiotic relationship, because it is not just about us giving money. It is about what the funding does. The funding is given in order to address societal challenges. So Vodacom is a JSE listed communications company. We are not created to attend to big welfare and humanitarian crises. So we need efficient delivery partners. And these NPOs that vary in size, from big ones such as Gift of the Givers, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, to small ones such as the Orlando Children's Home, they are our delivery partners. They don't just receive funding from us. They know societal challenges because they are on the ground more than we do. They are our ears and eyes, and they also hold us accountable on promises that we make of creating a better future. And how do we make these partnerships to be sustainable? One, mutual respect and removing power dynamics is important. Understanding what each party brings to the relationship is also very important. And then transparency, honesty, and integrity by both parties is key. NPOs also have to educate themselves, in our view, on the CSO trends globally and nationally, so that they should be able to adapt their operations. So I just want to make an announcement. I told my team that when we talk about the issue of partnerships and Vodacom doing more than just funding, Nick, it would have been good if I was there in person, but please just take a moment and listen to this. I want to make an offer now for you and the audience. Please select 3 NPOs using your own criteria that are attending the event today, and we will deploy ICT coordinator volunteers who have graduated from our Cisco and Microsoft training to provide digital skills for a period of 12 months to the tune of 250,000 rands. And Trialogue will then oversee the process. Once you have done the selection, we will also run our own corruption, money laundering, and terrorism check. So that's the offer. And I'm saying this to underscore, we don't just give money, we do more than that.
Takalani, I must let you know that there's been a wonderful response from the audience here in the form of applause, and we appreciate that the contribution and literally quite putting your money where your mouth is in terms of the contribution and participation that you're making. I'm not sure if the Vodacom Foundation representatives are in the room. We've put them on the spot now. There we go. Okay. So any NPOs in the room, I think you know who to speak to. See, we're trying to encourage that linkage and participation here. Very important points that have been mentioned, and I am aware that there are some difficulties in getting the questions from the chat, so we will prioritize questions from the audience as we're aware that we have about 5 more minutes for this conversation. Any questions in the room, please keep your hands up. We'd like you to address them, keep them succinct. Your hand has been noted, ma'am. A roving mic will make its way to you. Please keep your hand up just to make it easier for my colleagues to identify you. Yours too, sir. And let's come to the other side of the room. We'll come to you, ma'am. But we'll try to manage time to make sure that we address all the other 2 outstanding questions that have been raised. If you could keep it succinct, please, ma'am, and also let us know who you're addressing your question to. We'd like to take at least 3 questions in a row, just for the benefit of time.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. My name is Kamala Pillay. I'm from Symphonia of South Africa team. I think it's been a fantastic conversation around what we can do domestically to do better. I do think that international funding is still required, and it's an opportunity. But the problem is what Cello has mentioned is this power relationship. So my question, I think it's to Cello and to Becky, how do we change the conversation to make it not about international aid, but make it about international investment? And how do we as a social change community utilize our voice to also deal with this power dynamics? Clearly we can't do it in isolation. How do we come together and have a more equal relationship with international funders?
Thank you so much for your question, Ms. Pillay. I would like the microphone to get to our next speaker just to ensure that we're able to address the questions as succinctly as possible. You can go ahead, sir, if you can keep it brief. And there was another hand on the other side of the room. If the microphone could get to you just to be on standby. And we've got you ready, ma'am. Perfect. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Loud and clear, sir.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, what I wanted to say is to refer us back to the global economist, Dambisa Moyo, who researched and said that aid has actually been giving us a negative, opposed to developing Africa, actually we reaped negative benefits. She asked to say, if the leaders in Africa are to be told one day, we are cutting all the aid, what would happen? You would see that they would think sustainably. They would think about trade. They would think about how can they make systems in place. They would think about how can they develop their human resources. They will start to think things that actually lead to development itself. Aid is actually making them to actually sleep, if I'm to say. So we need to think about beyond trade, what other things. I think that's my submission. It's not a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions, and I like the contrasting views that we need to look at, right? The benefit of international aid, but also looking at how best we saw solutions if it had to be cut. The last question, ma'am, you've got your mic in hand. Please go ahead.
Morning. I've got a question for the panelists. There's a lot of conversation around African solutions for Africa. What are your thoughts on an African focus on Western issues and how that deters from us being able to remove our dependence from international aid? Do you think that that plays a contributing role at all in our dependence on international aid or not? The focus on Western problems, if you will, when we've got African issues that we've barely addressed.
Got you. Case in point, I would assume, Russia-Ukraine crisis and South Africa focusing there. Got you. Thank you so much. Perfect. I think we'll take the first question from Ms. Pillay, and perhaps, Silo, if you can address that one for us, as she mentioned, managing and balancing and changing that conversation around the power dynamics of international donors versus the local funders.
You know, for me, she mentioned something about international investment.
Yes.
And I think if we are to look at this critically, without being an expert on this, but I was part of a delegation that was taken by Hans Adel Foundation to Germany about 4 months ago. This was just after a few months after KZN riots, the violence in KZN. And one of the things that struck a chord with me was how we speak international investment, we walk a different walk, which is about how do we destroy ourselves well enough so that no one wants to bring in money. And I say it as bluntly as one of the investors said, South Africa speaks international investment, but your walk is a different one, where communities don't see these things as belonging to them. They are alienated from them so much that they believe these things are not ours. And a typical example I want to give you is we were in Soweto doing a food distribution. This is 2020, and the center manager got a call that her sister was gravely ill. And so she had to rush to take her sister to the hospital. She gets to the local private hospital. There's an upfront payment that needs to be made. I don't know what amount, but it was a few thousand rand. And that need to be made. Now, I watched this scenario. The sister did pass away, unfortunately. And I watched this scenario and I said, can you imagine that if you were a neighbor of this hospital and you die because you don't have 4,000 rand to pay,
Sure.
this hospital becomes a source of pain. It's alienated from self.
And resentment.
Resentment, just like the mall is. There was a young man who was interviewed after that violence in Soweto. He said, for the first time, I had the power of choice. And choice coming out of theft and destruction. So if we are to talk about international investment, we must begin to also invest in communities that they own these assets.
Yes.
Yeah.
That they feel that whatever is coming in actually is not alien to me. I am part of it, and therefore I should protect it with my life. And I think that's how we should be thinking about investment in the continent and in our country specifically. And also that way we win ourselves of aid.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that also addresses, as the gentleman was mentioning, that we need to look at these solutions without necessarily being placed under the pressure of not having that international funding and foreign aid. I'd like to go to the young lady's question that was also addressed, and perhaps, Becky, you can also address that for us. If we look externally to solve the rest of the world's problems, when we ourselves are struggling, I guess, simply put, does charity still begin at home?
Yeah, so I just want to combine the two because
Sure.
I think they are related. So for me, I also wanted to say that if you look at investments, there's the macro level, but there's also investment in the non-profit sector. How do donors invest in the non-profit sector? And I want to give an example. I'm working with a group in Nairobi now on something called decolonizing philanthropy. And they've given us a very interesting example of how they were funded by a bilateral organization that gave them 45 million US dollars. But that 45 million US dollars was with all sorts of conditions. And then comes a new donor, an individual who gives them $5 million and says, use it the way you want. And with that 5 million US dollars, they've gone on to set up their own income generating activity. They've set up an endowment and so forth and so on and so on. So in other words, the 45 million was not useful at all to them, but the 5 million was so useful because it has given them the liberty to do whatever they want.
Great perspective
Right.
on value.
So basically, investment is got to be something that you resonate with. It's got to be something that builds value for you. And I think what CAPSI has been doing now, and I'm doing some advert now, what CAPSI has been doing in its existence is to try and identify African solutions by looking at African sources and African resources that can be utilized to develop ourselves. There's no doubt that Africa is wealthy. It's so wealthy underground, but poor when you look at it. We have done studies of high net worth individuals in the continent. We are projected to overtake all the regions in terms of the growth of the population of high net worth individuals. As we speak right now, 3 individuals in the African continent are owning the world that is equivalent to half the population.
Sure.
Half the population of the continent. And so that tells us
3 people.
3 people.
I don't know if that you heard that. Okay.
So those studies have been done, and Oxfam can really come and give us all those figures here. But the point that I wanted to really make is that we have to identify solutions ourselves in the continent and really try to address this donor dependency, because I think we have to come back to your question. We have to address the donor dependency. One of the studies that was done previously showed that of the big foundations that fund here in Africa, one provides 70% of the funding of all the donors that fund here. And the second largest foundation in the continent from outside provides 4%. So from 70% to 4%, number one and number two. Imagine what happens if the 70% provider pulls out.
Yep.
Right? So that gives us all the reasons why we must look for solutions inward. And those solutions will come from the private sector. There are so many instruments that colleagues can talk about in terms of how we can generate income. Those solutions come from individuals. We have to talk about how we can raise resources from individuals, not just money, but other forms of resources as well. That those resources will also come from philanthropic institutions that have been established in the continent. So we do have the resources, and I wanted to invite everyone to also visit our Kisima initiative, which we have set up to actually immobilize people to give us their positive stories. And those positive stories lead to them then identifying causes wherever they are based that they can support. And then finally, we look at the impact that philanthropy has in terms of development.
Got you. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for those responses. Ducky, we'll come to you as well on the back of receiving these, the feedback and remarks as well, and the questions. Thank you for also sharing them. I do understand that, Professor Madonsela, you've got some feedback that you'd like to share with regard to this particular theme.
Thank you, Kuku. I know you had said you only wanted 3 people, and therefore, and thank you for letting me to queue jump. But I thought I needed to say something on this particular conversation. I understand the hesitancy about international donor funding. I think it comes from 2 places. The first place is the whole idea of he who pays the piper, which I think Sello has addressed, which means this community, I like somebody who said it's the social change community, needs to come together to firstly paint the pattern of what are we building together. When everything else is done together, what are we building? And therefore, when these monies come, they should be linked to a preconceived pattern when it comes to the picture. I saw in your book, in the Trialogue Business and Society Handbook, there's a mention of the idea of social compacting.
Yep.
So we probably need to do that, because once we've decided what are we building, if, for example, we've decided that we are building a stadium, if somebody brings us material that is meant for building a church, we will thank them, but will not take that, and vice versa. So that's number one. But the second reason, though, we're reluctant with donors is that I honestly think we're being fed that narrative by overseas countries, that Africa must find its own resources. In the same way that when we talk about restitutive redistribution of resources, we told, no, everyone must work as hard, which led me to create that game of Monopoly to show that if the game was rigged at the start, without a reset and redistribution of resources, the one team will always be behind. This continent was raped of its people, of its resources, and it has continuously lost money, even recently, through illicit financial transfers. So I just don't think we should buy into the conversation that says we shouldn't get some of that money back. I think we should get it back as part of restitution, but on our terms and on a purpose-driven way. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Professor Madonsela. And I think really a lot of insights that we can resonate with in terms of changing the narrative, and as you say, making sure that we ourselves are aligning that to our purpose. There's a lot more that we have to talk about, but unfortunately we are limited to time. But Ducky, I'll give it to you for just 30 seconds to share some of your closing statements, because as an institution, not only is Vodacom supporting initiatives across the continent, Vodafone through doing the same thing through its foundation, but of course also finding new innovative ways through through technology, through data, through enhanced partnerships, and even the commitment that you've made here today to shift the narrative. I guess your closing statement in terms of finding that alignment between foreign aid and of course studies to unpack foreign aid, and most importantly, mobilizing capital from the domestic front too.
Yes, as Vodacom, we use South African-based NPOs to identify societal challenges for us, and we also partner with government to understand those societal pain points. And that way we deploy our resources to solve those challenges. Nobody knows our problems better than we do. And yes, international partnerships are key, but they have to be contextual. But I want to bring something as my parting shot, which should serve as food for thought. What concerns us today is lack of awareness on the administrative burdens of running a foundation. Personally, I do get a lot of people seeking my advice on whether they should start a foundation or how they should go about doing it, because their lives were touched by an event which makes them to want to give back. But my advice is, unless you have loads and loads of cash, which is your money, to run programs, or unless you have guaranteed donors, like with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, because of what Mr. Mandela stood for, better approach an existing foundation and partner with them and give them your money to support a cause close to your heart. And even ask them to support it in your name. That way you don't have to go around asking for money and dealing with the nightmare of administrative paperwork. You are just a funder, and it still comes to the same thing. That foundation you fund becomes your delivery partner, and your name can even be inscribed on the wall of a project if you ask. But this is my personal preference. People have different ways of achieving their goals. I will be retiring in a few years, and I would like to continue giving. And you know what? Currently, I give through the Vodacom Foundation, which is a massive machinery, which receives financial and admin support from Vodacom, the company. When I retire, because I know what it means to run a foundation, I will not set up one. I will contribute my time and money to somebody else's foundation as a donor. That way, I will not have admin and foundation burdens removed from me, but I will also get fulfillment. So that is my parting shot. And as I said, it should be food for thought. Thank you.
Definitely. A woman who knows how to use her time. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience, for your participation, for your feedback, and for your enthusiasm, and of course, for being open to the various solutions and suggestions that have been offered by my panelists this morning. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your patience as well, as we are aware that we have run over, but I do think that this has been an invigorating conversation that leaves us with quite literally food for thought, as Takalani has mentioned. Again, a big thank you to all my panelists, and we will take a brief break for the moment. Those of you joining us online and those of you who are here with us in the room, we will have our tea break. We will commence with the second half of the program at about 11:45, if I'm not mistaken, so 11:45. Please be back, seated promptly in your seats. That's where we'll shift gears and focus on the green economy and key themes that we need to be mindful of there. But as you make your way to engage, network, and of course, deliberate on much of the conversations that have been shared, we encourage you as well to share your thoughts and insight. Quick one for the NPOs who are in the room. Apologies, ma'am. You will be able to take a break in a moment. You heard the announcement that Takalani had mentioned, 200,000, if I'm not mistaken, or 250,000? 250, there we go. We're upping it, 250,000. To any NPOs who are in the room and would perhaps like to share their details and suggestions, you've been invited to share your details at the Vodacom exhibition stand for a chance to win the generous ICT support that Taki has committed. So NPOs in the room, the Vodacom stand at the exhibition hall, please feel free to share your details there. Enjoy the tea break. We'll see you at 12:45. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.